Hello and welcome to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming. Thank you so much for joining us today for Astronaut Academy. So my name is Alicia. I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City, and I will be your host today for our program. And just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free, but if you'd like to support us in delivering our programs, please do click on the link in the comments or in the description. Also, feel free to use the chat today and say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And also let us know if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before, or maybe if you plan on visiting us again sometime soon. So today we are going to be talking a little bit about what it took to become one of NASA's early astronauts. So those guys were looked at back then as big time celebrities, and we are going to look a little bit about how those qualifications have changed throughout history up through today. But before we get into that, I would like to back up just a bit and talk about why we, a former Navy ship, are even a space museum in the first place. So for those of you who may not be familiar, this is the Intrepid Museum. So we are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed in 1943 and it served in 3 wars: World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And then in 1982, it was converted into what it is now, the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. So we are docked right off the shoreline of Manhattan in the Hudson River, just a short walk from Times Square, and we are now open to the public 7 days a week. So come on by and visit us sometime. So in our name, it is pretty clear why we are a sea museum, because of course we were a naval ship, an aircraft carrier that served out in the ocean, kind of like a floating airport, you could say. And it carried, of course, planes as an aircraft carrier and equipment and sailors to places that were very far across the sea. We are also an air museum because we carried, launched, and landed a number of airplanes and helicopters, and we could actually hold up to about 100 of them on board. And this picture you see here is of the Avenger on the right. So that is our oldest airplane on display from World War II. But why are we also a space museum? Well, take a look at this. So does anyone know, tell me in the chat if you do, what this thing is? What is this big, black, almost light bulb or flashlight shaped looking thing here? It says United States on it. It's got a flag on it. Now, some people say it kind of even looks like an ice cream cone that's been tilted on its side. Or maybe it's a megaphone, you can shout into to make yourself louder. Now, this is a very special vehicle, everyone. This is something called a space capsule, and it is very special because this is how our astronauts used to go up into space. So a while ago in the 1960s, of course, during this Cold War era, NASA, our space program, was in a race, a space race with the Soviet Union, or what you would call modern day Russia. And of course, every race has a finish line, right? Well, ours was to be the very first country to safely land a man all the way on the moon and return him back home again. But, of course, there were a number of smaller steps that we still had to take before making that giant leap out on the moon. Just roll out of bed and end up on the moon, right? So we had to first figure out things like how to even get up into space with rockets and how to breathe and sleep and eat and work for long periods of time. So this is part of one of those smaller steps. And this also has to do with why we are a space museum. So this is a replica of a Mercury space capsule. And this is what those early astronauts rode inside of during those earliest missions into space, even before we went to the moon. Now, in 1962, this guy, Scott Carpenter, one of our earliest astronauts, went up in a capsule just like this one. You can actually see it on the very top of that rocket on the right there, that kind of triangular Hershey Kiss type shape on the very top there. So the rocket over there has that all those flames going out of the bottom, goes up into space, right? So he went up in his capsule, he orbited the Earth a few times, and then he came down after doing some experiments. But of course, what goes up must come back down. So eventually, he came back down to Earth, and he landed where all the rest of the astronauts were landing at the time, in the ocean. So they figured that the water would be a nice, kind of softer landing place than on land or, in the desert or in someone's house, right? And it was a bit easier to aim for, too, because water covers 70% of the Earth. So after floating around in space, those astronauts would be out there floating around in the water in the middle of the ocean. And then eventually people would come to rescue them in a helicopter and also retrieve their space capsule. And so, everyone, on two very special occasions, once during the Mercury missions and once during the Gemini missions, the Intrepid got to be the prime recovery vessel and pick them up. Now, looking at these pictures here, how do you think those sailors on board felt to be a part of such a cool thing like this process of going into space? Pretty amazing, right? Here's two pictures now, again, from retrieval. On the left there, you can even see all those sailors lined up along the side of the Intrepid looking on. So yeah, I would imagine they would be pretty excited on that day. And we actually have some postcards and things in our collections that were printed just to celebrate this occasion. And so, yes, definitely lots of sailors wrote home to their loved ones saying, whoa, guess what just happened today? We got to pick up some astronauts. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is why we are also a space museum. The Intrepid played a really important role in picking up astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space during our earliest missions. Now, again, during those early steps, Project Mercury, it was really just to see if people could even reach outer space in the first place and survive up there for a while before setting their sights a bit further away on the moon. And I will tell you, that race that we were involved in, it was not going so well up to this point. The United States kept losing every step of the way to the Soviet Union in pretty much everything. So they got the first satellite in space, they got the first animal in space, even the first man and the first woman in space. So we were always pretty close behind, but we just kind of kept getting beaten, even just by a couple of days sometimes. So imagine, being an American at that time. How do you think that felt? Yeah, you'd be pretty frustrated, right? Now, of course, if your goal is to eventually send a man to the moon, you got to have the men, right? The astronauts. And arguably, some of the most famous astronauts were these guys, who soon became known as the Mercury 7. Now, in this famous picture on the left, we have from left to right Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, Deke Slayton, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Gordon Cooper, and Scott Carpenter. Scott Carpenter, you might recognize that name. Again, that guy that we picked up in the Mercury capsule back in 1962. And we also later picked up Gus Grissom on Gemini 3. He's the shorter guy in the center of the back row there. So in 1959, these 7 men, these brave and brilliant test pilots in peak physical condition, they were selected to be our very first astronauts as part of NASA's very first space missions, the Mercury space program. And it's actually kind of interesting. A lot of people don't realize this, but Project Mercury was originally supposed to be called Project Astronaut. But remember, this was before we even, had the word astronaut. That hadn't really been invented yet. But the name didn't really stick around for the project because they realized, well, they didn't really want to make it about the people so much as the mission as a whole. And of course, the goal of the space race, right? Getting to the moon. So instead, they called it Project Mercury, which focused more on that goal of being the first and the fastest to get to the moon. So Mercury, if you know your planets, of course, is the first planet from the sun, and it's also the fastest planet in our solar system that orbits around the sun. So Mercury, of course, named after the Roman messenger god, kind of like their mailman, very, very fast. So what were the qualifications for astronauts, right? And how do you even train and prepare someone to exist in the conditions of space with no information about any previous astronauts and people going into space? You're really just making guesses about what space is even like at that point. And then also, how can you train them? How do you simulate or recreate that sort of unusual feeling that they might expect up there? But how do you do that down here on Earth? How do you give them that feeling of weightlessness or disorientation, that you might feel in space? Well, to start, NASA had to put together a basic set of requirements to figure out just the baseline of health for these guys, to study them while they were in space. They, of course, wanted the best of these people for their missions, though, so they had to think about the ideal traits that they would want an astronaut to have. Now, these qualifications to become one of the first Mercury astronauts, they really all stem from the same criteria that was currently being used for high-altitude research flights. So basically military test pilots, because at the time, that was the closest thing that they had to space flight. These guys were going pretty high and pretty fast. And They figured, yeah, by virtue of the fact that those guys were still alive, yeah, they were probably pretty good at their job. So, in addition to serving in the military, the qualifications were that you had to be under 40 years of age and in excellent physical condition. You had to have a height of 5 feet 11 inches or less to fit into the suits in those small capsules. You had to hold at least a bachelor's degree or the equivalent in a science or engineering field. And you had to be a qualified jet pilot with at least 1,500 hours of flight time. Now, as you can imagine, that kind of narrowed the field quite a bit. In fact, at the time, there were only 110 men that met those basic requirements. And that was about 22% of all the candidates that they screened. And then, after a series of tests, only about 32 of them were selected to advance onto the next round of testing, very much in the public eye. Before then, the final 7 were chosen for the Mercury missions in 1959. So they underwent rigorous physical and psychological experiments to test the limits of what the body could withstand. So they said they had, experiments where there was extreme heat and cold, and these giant centrifuges to simulate gravitational pull from the Earth at takeoff, and electrodes to measure their brain activity, so much more. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of those tests in just a minute. But Scott Carpenter, that astronaut we talked about before, he once said that, he looked at this whole experience as a test of his determination. And he thought that showing any discomfort at all meant showing weakness. And really for him, it was all about mind over matter. Now, John Glenn, another one of our famous astronauts, felt the same way about it. But then there were others who thought it might have been a little bit too much. Deke Slayton said that he once actually felt like a captive specimen at the time, like a lab rat. They were just examining him all the time. And Pete Conrad said that he started to feel like NASA only cared about their bodies and that they weren't placing enough emphasis on their other qualifications, like being a trained pilot or having an engineering degree. These tests were definitely skewed a little bit more in the physical direction. So, all of this highly publicized testing, it really did spur interest in the space program. But it also made some people start to think a little bit more about these qualifications. Okay, you've got these specific things, but why couldn't a woman be just as capable as a man based on these tests? So, with all the Cold War tensions mounting, right, this race is heating up. There's rumors in the Soviet Union space program that there are women. And at this point, we were still in the running to win that one. Now, some Americans began to question the purpose of a sex restriction. So, a few months later, the aviation editor of the popular periodical Look magazine decided to do a feature around this question of the restriction of women. And NASA's approval, they invited champion aviator and race car driver Betty Skelton to be the very first woman to undergo the Mercury project's testing protocol at NASA's research facilities, due to her acrobatic flying records and her background in automobile racing, as well as her mental strength and her fast reflexes. So she jumped at the opportunity, and over a period of 4 months, she got to travel across the country to various testing facilities to meet with Project Mercury and Soviet space scientists, and she got to brave this intense testing regimen alongside the Mercury 7 themselves. And she said it was the biggest thrill that she had ever had. She had the opportunity during all of this to get to know the astronauts personally, and they went through the testing process right alongside her too. And even more impressed by her flying record and skill, they even gave her the honorary nickname 7.5. But you have to remember, going into space, it's not a walk on the beach here on Earth. So in addition to a physical examination, she performed over 80 tests. Some are pictured here, including some that involved swallowing a tube to monitor her digestion. She had dye injected to measure her liver absorption rates. They monitored how fast her hand could close while shocking her with electricity. She had a test where they squirted cold water in her ear to make her dizzy. And she also sat in a sensory deprivation chamber for hours to test her responses to isolation. She walked on treadmills that got steeper and faster. They tested her lung capacity. Again, this hot and cold. She worked underwater even to study disorientation in near weightlessness. But fun fact, she actually couldn't swim, but she didn't tell them that. Now, throughout this process, she also experienced some things that made her a little uncomfortable at NASA. The astronauts or the scientists would sometimes say or do things that made her realize that they weren't really interested or even prepared to seriously consider women as astronauts at the time. And while she was visiting NASA headquarters in Virginia, she said she didn't even think that they had ever even had women around in their ready rooms before at all. There was also a test where the administrators couldn't figure out what she should wear while she was lying on a tilting platform. You can actually see this picture right there on the left. And, at first they recommended a hospital gown. Maybe you've worn one of those thin paper gowns before. But they thought better of it once they realized, yeah, that table's going to be going upside down with her feet in the air, as you can see there. So instead, they gave her a pair of oversized men's pajamas. And to make matters worse, they hadn't told her to bring a change of shoes. So she wandered around the whole facility the whole time wearing her high heels and men's pajamas. Now, a lot of these people called her nicknames like Cosmonauty or Astronaut or Space Girl and Lady Astro, but she took a lot of it in stride. And while she knew that this experience was largely going to be a publicity stunt and that the results of her trials weren't really going to suddenly convince anyone at NASA to begin accepting women, she still felt obligated to do her very best. And she really wanted to prove that women had the potential to do really well in this role as an astronaut. And the nation watched her. They were really interested. So the events that unfolded here, again, were the first time that a woman underwent the same physical and psychological evaluations to be an astronaut as her male counterparts. And this experience ultimately became the cover feature for Look's February 2nd, 1960 issue, with Betty Skelton wearing a prototype spacesuit in front of a Mercury capsule replica. We saw that kind of light bulb shaped thing behind her. And it is under the headline, "Should a Girl Be First in Space?" So it was kind of an inspiring glimpse into what could have been. And it referred to her inside the article as a petite example of the anatomical fact that women have more brains and stamina per pound than men. So the Look article, it really fueled public interest even more. And it sparked a lot of frustration as well from her fellow female pilots who really wanted to be a part of this. But it also really sparked interest from scientists who grew even more curious about maybe women could offer some other things that men couldn't do. Now, shortly thereafter, with all of the excitement, there was another fascinating experiment that began on 13 women who are now referred to as the Mercury 13. Now, Dr. Randolph Lovelace, who was the doctor who originally had developed all of the tests for the Mercury project, he set up his own privately funded program just for women. And he even suggested that it might be more practical from an engineering standpoint to send women into space over men because they generally weighed less, so they would require less fuel to get them into space and would also need less oxygen to survive. So it'd be saving money there too. So in February of 1960, this is just weeks after the Look magazine hit the shelves, he started to screen and test his own candidates, who later became known as the First Lady Astronaut Trainees, or the Flats, at his facility in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He had 19 women that went through it, and 13 of them passed and are, again, now more commonly referred to today as the Mercury 13. And you can see a whole bunch of pictures of them here that were featured in Life magazine. Now, Jerry Cobb, one of these women who is in that big picture on the right, she even passed in the top 2% of all of the participants to ever take the test, even the men. So the evidence was really becoming clear that the women were just as qualified as the men. But at the same time, this kind of scared NASA. They were already feeling a lot of pressure to succeed in this space race. They didn't want anything to go wrong or distract them from getting to the moon. So just 1 year later, they had his program shut down. But, those ladies didn't give up. They continued to protest to anyone who would listen, even to the president. And I love this picture. It says that, women should be trained as astronauts as well. They're carrying their little signs around, the little picketing. So this letter actually on the right here was drafted in 1962 for the president to send to the NASA administrator, James Webb. But as you can see the writing on the bottom of it there, well, President Lyndon Johnson was not having any of it. In fact, he wrote, "Let's stop this now," across it, and he filed it away in his desk, never to be seen again until many years later. So, again, pretty frustrating. Now, some of the Mercury 13 even took part in meetings of Congress. They spoke to Congress about women having the chance to go into space as well. But in those hearings, John Glenn himself, the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth, he even testified against them. And he said, quote, "It's just a fact. The men go off to fight the wars and fly the airplanes and come back and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order." Now, that might be a little surprising to hear today. John Glenn's one of our national heroes, and even he wouldn't back them up then. So sadly, nothing ever really came of their fight. Now, again, this was 1962, and we were always just one step behind the Soviet Union in our space race. So because of this, just 1 year later in 1963, Valentina Tereshkova of the Soviet Union, who you can see on the left there, broke the sex barrier and beat us to being the first woman in space. And sadly, it would take another 20 years before the same opportunity was offered to an American woman, Sally Ride, in 1983, who we do love and celebrate, but oh man, that took a long time, right? Now, I mentioned some of these tests that the trainees went through, but before we get into more details about what those were like, I want to pause and see if we have any questions about some of the stuff that I have mentioned so far. So, any questions so far? Let's see what we got. Why are they called astronauts? So NASA got that word from the naming tradition that started with the Argonauts. If you know your Greek mythology, the Latin root there of naut, N-A-U-T, it means sailor. So if you're familiar with Greek mythology, those were those guys, the Argonauts, that sailed around in the ship called the Argo. So maybe you've heard of Jason and the Argonauts. They're searching for that golden fleece. And then there was the naming tradition that went on with the aeronauts. So sky sailors, aeronaut, those are people that flew around in hot air balloons and things like that. And then eventually we had astronauts, which would basically then mean sailors of the stars. So a perfect name for that position, astronauts. All right, any other questions? Did any of the women who did the astronaut test get to go into space? No, sadly, they were all really, really qualified, but unfortunately, it just wasn't the right time. And NASA didn't really, want to have them be astronauts yet. Now, many have passed away since then of those women, but back then, when they were still launching the space shuttles, and this was now, actually after they had started women being allowed to be astronauts too. They were maybe a little bit too old at that point, so they weren't allowed to do that. But NASA did invite them to come and watch some of the launches from time to time. They definitely kept in touch with them. And they were actually all there when Eileen Collins became the first woman to pilot the space shuttle. So they definitely followed along with the program, but no, sadly, they never actually got to go and become astronauts and go into space, unfortunately. But let's talk about, everyone, some of that astronaut training. All right. So what did it look like back then for those early missions? Well, in all, there were about 87 exercises, both physical, again, meaning about your body, and psychological, meaning more about your mind. And they were done over 3 phases. So phase 1 involved testing the limits, again, of the human body by simulating or recreating some of those conditions that they expected the astronauts to encounter while in space. Now, they had no idea what was going to happen to their bodies because, again, no one had ever been up there yet. Maybe their eyes would start to change shape and they wouldn't be able to see, or maybe they wouldn't be able to swallow or eat food. They had no clue. So they were really just making up these tests and their flight plans as they went. And so they did a number of tests to withstand stress and pain on their body. And for one test, they were sealed into a room that was heated up to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is super hot. And there's a picture of Scott Carpenter sweating through his jumpsuit doing that. And then in another test on the opposite side of that spectrum, they would sometimes hold their hands and feet in ice water for several minutes and then have their blood pressure measured. So they wanted to see how you reacted to these extremes of hot and cold. Now, in another test, they shocked them, again, with electrical pulses to test their reflexes. So you can see a picture of Jerry Cobb of the Mercury 13 doing that on the right. And if you've ever been shocked, maybe by accident, maybe you're walking across carpet and you reach out to touch a doorknob, maybe you'd feel that. But yeah, it's like 100 times more powerful than that. And in yet another one, they also shoved a 3-foot rubber hose down their throat to monitor their digestion while they were eating food. So again, these tests were all meant to see how your body's going to react in normal and also extreme simulations. Now, another test they did was, again, to shoot this ice water into their ears to give them something called vertigo. So that's when you get really, really dizzy. So in the pictures on the side here, we can see Wally Schirra and Jerry Cobb getting that cold water shot into one ear. And then that can start something called nystagmus. And that is when your eyes start moving really uncontrollably because you're really, really dizzy. So those funny looking glasses that Wally is wearing there let the doctors see that reaction in his eyes a little bit more clearly. And then on the other part of that test, they wanted to see how long it took you to regain your sense of balance. So this was meant to simulate what you might feel if your space capsule is ejected from the rocket booster and it starts tumbling around really, really fast. So to test your balance, they would have you then walk on a balance beam that you can see on the right. John Glenn is doing just grand. He's looking spiffy in his bow tie there. Scott Carpenter doing not as well. But you can even try this at home, everyone. If you spin around in a circle a few times, just keep going until you get really, really dizzy, and then try to walk in a straight line. See how long it takes for you to regain that sense of balance. That's basically the same thing that they were doing there. Now, they also tested on treadmills and stationary bikes, but to an extreme to test their strength and their breathing. So you can see here things like keeping a steady pace, but for 10 minutes on a beat, and then going up and down simulated hills. Sometimes they were even hooked up to a breathing apparatus there to test their lung functions while they were doing it and their oxygen intake, because oxygen's pretty important when you're up in space in a capsule. And these tests here, this breathing stuff, they sometimes would equate them to saying it was kind of like the lung-powered equivalent of that game at the fair where you have a sledgehammer, and you hit the thing and it goes up onto the bell. So they said you just had to breathe really hard and see what would happen with that. Now, they also had some other tests for your balance, like an equilibrium test to try to throw off your sense of balance while you were doing a task. That's where these tilt table tests came in also to see how dizzy you got while you were lying down and then being upside down. And they would basically, you'd lie down flat on a table and your heart rate and your blood pressure would be measured every minute for 30 minutes. And they were going like this with you, just going horizontal and up to a 65-degree angle and back again and up and down. So that is, again, one of the tests that they put Betty Skelton in the pajamas for, by the way. Now, they also trained on an orbital flight simulator centrifuge. So that is basically a capsule that is attached to a long arm, and then it simulates the G-forces that you might feel during launch and landing by swinging that capsule around in a circle at different speeds and at different tilts. So on the left here, you can see Gus Grissom and Scott Carpenter. Again, those two guys that we picked up on the Intrepid in different missions, riding on this centrifuge, all strapped in and feeling like that. Now, what does that feel like, right? So there are some popular carnival rides that maybe you've been on where they spin you around in a circle and you kind of stick to the wall. The floor drops out. I always love that ride. So it's kind of like that. But also, if you've ever been to Disney World, there is this ride called Mission Space. And it actually uses the exact same principle to simulate those G-forces of you taking off and landing in a space shuttle, actually. They're spinning you around the room on this arm, just like that trainer. Only on the ride, you're only feeling about 2.5 times gravity. And the Apollo missions, it was more like 10 times that. So I think the most that someone has ever gone through has been something like 14 Gs. So that is like feeling 14 times your body weight on your chest while you're doing it. And you feel that. I mean, look at Gus Grissom's face here. He's kind of got that facelift thing going on, right? So feeling that pressure on him for sure. Now, another ride that you might associate with NASA training is the famous Mastiff Simulator. Now, that stood for Multiple Axis Space Test Inertia Facility. All right, so that again is going to simulate this idea of your capsule tumbling about in space. Only now, this was there to test your actual reaction in terms of gaining control of your spacecraft. So the Mastiff was this big 21-foot rig with 3 metal cages that allowed movement in all 3 directions. So what we call pitch, which is up and down, right? Yaw, which is side to side like this, and then roll, which is kind of like rolling over like a dog, right? So all this is happening at the same time, and at the very center is a replica of a Mercury space capsule. And there's a seat there and a hand controller. So the trainees had to use this controller to try to regain control of their capsule while all these rings are spinning. And apparently the first time Alan Shepard, our first American in space, wrote it in 1960, he instantly turned green and he hit the kill switch to make it stop. So it took a little bit of training on that too. Now, the Mastiff Simulator is similar to the multi-axis trainer, which is probably the first thing that people think of when they think of astronaut training, especially if you've ever been to space camp before. But that one was actually never used. It's more of a novelty thing for visitors to experience themselves. So this one was a little different. Now, again, a lot of these were done because they simply didn't know what would happen to the human body. So it was kind of over preparation. And once they, were a few flights in, they realized that, some of these were probably unnecessary. So they got rid of a few of them. Now, phase 2 had a number of psychological exercises. Again, things having to do with your mind. Now, if you've ever heard the word psychology before, again, it has to do with the way you think. So things like IQ tests, anxiety tests, the Rorschach test or the inkblot test there, hundreds and hundreds of questions to try to frustrate and annoy them or just to dig deep into their personalities. And these were important to make sure that they could stay focused and calm in these very stressful situations because these were pretty high-risk missions. Now, later in Gemini and Apollo, it was also important because they were going to be teamed up with others for long periods of time in really small spaces. So imagine having to take a really long road trip with a sibling, maybe. You might love them, but sometimes they might get on your nerves a little bit, right? Well, the astronauts did and did not take these seriously because, again, they thought it might have been a little bit much, and maybe it was. For instance, during his inkblot test, which is, of course, when you're looking at these smears of ink on a piece of paper, and then you say what you think it looks like. So it's kind of like finding, a shape in the clouds or in the stars, right? So Pete Conrad, he was presented with a card that looked like this. All right, so what do we see here, right? Nothing. It was blank. So he saw this card and he thought, well, this is just so silly. So he thought he'd be funny. He looked at this card for a long time. He's squinting at it. He's hemming and hawing. Oh, could this be? I don't know. Until finally he told the doctor that he just simply couldn't see it properly. So the doctor looked confused. And he said, no, I can't see it properly. You're holding the card upside down. Which, of course, is so silly because it's blank, right? So needless to say, he did not make the cut to be one of the first 7 astronauts. Now, the inkblot test was developed in 1921 to be used in hospitals to figure out what possible mental disorders the patients might have to help to diagnose them with their problems. But of course, anyone outside of a hospital can take this too. And really, no matter how you answer it, it could be interpreted a variety of ways. So we can kind of take any meanings with a grain of salt here. There is a lot of skepticism over whether this test is actually valid, but it can be kind of fun to do too. So the way that it works, again, is kind of like finding images in the stars or in the clouds. There's a series of 10 cards, and you are supposed to just say the first thing that comes to mind that you see. So there's no right or wrong answer. There's no way to win at the inkblot test here. It's very subjective, very open to interpretation, and your results might say that you are really creative, or maybe you're feeling a little upset right now. Could be anything. So keeping this in mind, and also keeping in mind that I am not a doctor, let's look at a few of these together, shall we? So this is the first inkblot in the test. Tell me in the chat, what do you think this looks like to you, all right? So take a look here. Again, let me know in the chat what you think this looks like. Maybe you see a bat. Maybe you see a butterfly. These are some common answers here. Maybe you see an angel with some outstretched wings, all right? Maybe you see an animal. Maybe it kind of looks like a cat. Or maybe you see a face in there, maybe a mask. Maybe you see a jack-o'-lantern, right? So at Halloween time, we might carve a pumpkin and see that scary face in there. So thinking about that, we can also look at it sideways. So maybe you see something different now. Do you see anything different? So when I look at this, I actually think it kind of looks like a pig on the top. I see those ears and the little snout there. But some people have said that they see here a battleship. And they see its reflection in the water sailing away there too. Now, according to this test, seeing a mirrored reflection like that means that you have a great imagination. Although they also say if you see a battleship, if that's the first thing that comes to mind when you look at it sideways here, it might mean that you have a little bit of anger or frustration going on too, because battleships are a wartime thing, right? Now, here's another one we can look at. What do you see here? The most common answer for this one, which you might see, is two people facing each other, all right? Maybe you see gnomes or something with little hats, right? They're wearing little red hats. You see that? The main thing about this particular image is if you can't see two people in it, they say maybe you've got some issues with your relationships with other people. But what else can you see here? We can look at it the different way here. Maybe you can look at the white area just in the center there. So some people say that maybe that looks like a jet fighter from above, or maybe from below. If you've seen some of our other programs about camouflage, right? You might know how we paint some of our planes white on the underside to blend in with clouds. So maybe you're looking up at their plane there. But if you said that this image, the first thing you see here is two bears fighting with lots of blood everywhere, they say you might be a little bit anxious or a little bit nervous about something right now. Now, here is the last one here. This one's kind of fun and fitting for our program today. What do you see here? So looking at this one, looking at the different colors and shapes here, this one is often interpreted as a rocket launching upward with flames below it and smoke around it. Do you see that? Or maybe, you can see fire, right? With those colors, the red and the yellow there. Or maybe when you're looking at it, maybe you see, I see Vash says a frog sitting in a flower bed. Sure, maybe you see all the colorful flowers there. You might even see different things in each of the different colors too. So if you maybe see different things, that means apparently you're very organized in your thinking. So overall, everyone, when analyzing your responses, they said generally if you have positive answers that describe things that are alive and flourishing, like flowers or cute animals or people dancing or that sort of things, that's great. But if you start seeing things that are negative or sad or really mean connotations like dead animals, like a smushed insect or something like that, or animals that are fighting each other, that's when they start to look a little bit more closely into your personality quirks and think you might not be a very good fit for teaming up with someone in a small capsule for a long period of time. So this draws a lot from the field of psychology, again, having to do with your mind, but also these are just kind of fun to look at too, aren't they? And everyone, actually at home, you can create your own inkblot artwork really easily. All you have to do is take a piece of paper and fold it in half. Then you open it back up again, stick some paint on the paper, fold it back again, and then the really fun part, you smush it all up inside. But you want to be careful that the paint doesn't come out the sides. Once you've done that, then you open it up, and voila, you've got an original piece of art that is symmetrical. So that means it's the same on both sides. And that is effectively how the inkblots were made. So once you've done that, you can look at it and think, what does your artwork look like, right? Well, who knows? It's totally up to you and what you see. And then you can go around asking your friends, what do you see in this too? So back to the testing, though, everyone. They also were asked a number of questions and brain teasers. So analogies, right? Questions that they ask you to compare and contrast things to each other, which I actually always really loved on the SAT personally. But let's try this one together. All right. So this is to say metabolism is to blank as combustion is to locomotive. So tell me in the chat which of these answers, A, B, C, or D, do you think is the best fit for this one? So this means we are comparing the two. So what does combustion or, setting things on fire, right? And helping it move, what does that have to do with a locomotive? That metabolism or the way that our bodies process food have to do with blank. Do you think metabolism has to do with engine, train, human, or anabolism? Which of these do you think it is? A, B, C, or D? I'll give you a second to put your answer in the chat for me. This is a real question that they were asked, actually. And the answer, everyone, is C, human, because humans have metabolisms, whereas locomotives use combustion to help them move. So our metabolisms help us move and help us to process things and to be alive as well. Here's another question. Adolescence is to blank as infancy is to nursery. Now, that might be a big word for us. Adolescence, that means being a teenager. So which of these answers do you think makes the most sense? A, B, C, or D? Adolescence is to asylum, youth, orphanage, or high school? We can think about the connection between infancy and nursery. So infants might be in a nursery. Where would you find teenagers, adolescents? Would you find them in an asylum, youth, orphanage, or high school, most likely? Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot in the chat here now too. D, right? High school makes the most sense. So that is some of the things that they would have to go through. And they went through hundreds of these types of questions. Here's another one that they had, spatial visualization. So they're given picture puzzles to test things, to imagine how things move in space. So if you look at this one, you look at the picture on the left here, we have an alarm clock that is upside down. And they say if you've got this ball, this sphere here, and there's an arrow pointing, this ball is going to be turning that direction. So if you took that alarm clock and you turned it that same direction, which of these should it look like? Now, imagine everyone, this is an alarm clock where it's got to wind up on the back. So there is going to be something sticking out of one side of it, and the face side will be smooth. So if you look at these, A, B, C, or D, and if you were to rotate it that direction, which one of these is it going to look like? Vash and Kit in the chat say B. All right, and there you go. Now that's a simple one. There were some where it had, 4 different steps of movement and you really had to think about it. But this is another type of test that they would take. Lastly, they would also, well, not lastly, just among the others, really, they had a lot of open-ended questions. Things like, who am I? What does that even mean, right? They had to write down 20 ways to identify themselves, rank them in order of significance or importance to them, and then these were analyzed to look at how they saw themselves. We also had open-ended questions like, who would you like to accompany you on a 2-man mission? So again, trying to see how they dealt with others. And also, who would you assign to the mission if you could not go yourself? So they wanted to see how they got along with their fellow astronaut candidates. Lots of questions. Now, the Mercury 13 women also experienced an extra test, a sensory deprivation isolation tank that was designed to simulate being weightless in a capsule in your spacesuit while in orbit. And they basically had to float in a tank of warm body temperature water in a pitch black, soundproof room. And previously, all of the test subjects, regardless of whether they were male or female, didn't make it past 6.5 hours without beginning to hallucinate and see and hear things that weren't there. But one of the Mercury 13 women, Wally Funk, was so good at this, she unknowingly set the all-time record for sensory deprivation at that time at 10 hours and 35 minutes. Now, the Mercury 7 guys actually didn't even do this experiment. Their isolation consisted of being a 2-3-hour stints in a dark room with padded walls, and they also had a piece of paper and a pen, and that was what they considered good enough to simulate isolation in space. I don't know why. John Glenn during this time ended up just writing poetry, and he made lists of things he could do while in the dark, and Wally Schirra just took a nap. But later on, the doctor who worked on these tests said that they were absolutely ridiculous. They were not meaningful in any way, shape, or form because there was no actual weightlessness in it, and they were also allowed to do something. But in regards to this isolation tank, he later estimated that spending just 15 minutes in it was probably the equivalent of spending 2 days in that room that the men had gone through. So imagine Wally Funk, 10 hours and 35 minutes. That was actually more like she spent 84 days in that dark room with a pad and a piece of paper and a pencil. So that's really bonkers and good for her, right? So in all, these tests were designed, again, not only to test how well they handled psychological, mental stress, but also to understand why they tick, right? And how they tick a little bit better, and to understand why they wanted to go to space in the first place. Did they just want to become famous, or did they like to take risks? So the perfect candidate was somewhere in between. They were really excited about it, but not to the point of being reckless. Now, lastly, Phase 3 involved a lot of training in regards to stressful situations and their responses to those. So they had a number of fitness drills, running, chin-ups, sit-ups, climbing over walls, stuff that they just made you keep going even though you wanted to pass out. And I don't know about you guys, but I basically hit that point after about 3 push-ups, so I don't think I would ever survive Phase 3. But they also had an altitude chamber test where, they'd stick 18 needles into your head to measure your brain activity. Then they strapped you into a seat in a plane and just did really death-defying feats up to like 65,000 feet, dropping you, going up, doing loops, just to see how you would react mentally. And then there was also, of course, survival training. So if something went wrong on reentry during your mission, you could land anywhere, right? And that was actually the case with Scott Carpenter when we picked him up. He was about 250 miles off course from where he was supposed to be when he landed. So a lot of this training was, of course, surviving in the water or in the jungle or maybe in the desert. So these pictures are also kind of fun here. On the top left, you can see a bunch of the astronauts hanging out in their rafts. Some of them are using these mirror devices that pilots would carry with them to help reflect the sun to attract planes that are flying overhead to pick them up. So they'd see the reflection down below and they'd know where they were. And the picture on the bottom left is actually Gus Grissom and John Young preparing for their water landing, the very same one that the Intrepid picked up, Gemini 3. And on the right, we see some survival training in the jungle, and on the bottom, also in the desert, too. So again, if they landed out there in the desert in that direct sunlight, and they had to know how to protect themselves, right? They didn't want to get sunburned, so they went through a lot of training simulations for that too. And this picture, there they are after one of those simulations, not looking too thrilled about it, but looking pretty chic in their outfits there. Now, they also did something called the Dilbert Dunker, which is a replica of an aircraft cockpit from the Navy. So the trainee would sit in it, and then it would shoot down a 45-degree ramp, and then it was turned upside down in a pool of water to recreate what a crash landing might actually be like in the ocean. So you had to be able to unharness yourself and get out of your cockpit and come up for safety while underwater. And then, of course, there was lots of other underwater training in something called the Neutral Buoyancy Simulator for that weightlessness, right, that you feel in. You can see that in some other images here. Basically, they went into a giant swimming pool. They practiced with this thing called an aqua lung that let them breathe underwater. And also, they had their big, heavy spacesuits, but they were weighted accordingly so that they didn't really rise and they didn't really sink. So that neutral buoyancy. So that was able to effectively simulate weightlessness or floating around in space. Now, one other thing you might think of when you think of weightlessness is an airplane that has since been named the Vomit Comet, or nicknamed that anyway. It was used to simulate weightlessness by flying in sharp parabolas, so up and down, just like that. And they would put them into free fall for about 20 seconds at a time and make it really feel like you were floating. Now, a version of this plane has actually always been used for astronaut training. Falling through the sky, I guess you could say, is really the closest thing we can get to that feeling of free fall in space. And it was even used during the shuttle era and still to today. And so in this lovely animated GIF here, you can see Sally Ride doing some somersaults in the air on board one of those. And of course, now there are also private companies that can do that for you too, if you are so inclined. So if you want to pay some money, they will gladly take you up in an airplane and do this. And hopefully you will not lose your lunch like Alan Shepard. And then, as you would imagine, there's also quite a bit of studying of their spacecraft systems, their mission objectives, celestial navigation, so that's finding your way in the stars, physics and engineering, and the many experiments that, of course, were going to be performed in each mission. Then they had to stay up to date on flying military planes, so a lot of training every week in jets like the T-38 Talon. We actually have one of those at the Intrepid Museum up on our flight deck, so come check that out. And also training in simulators. So they had lots of early flight simulators for both planes and their spacecraft and spent a lot of time in those too. Now, later in the Apollo era, the moon landing missions, they also had additional training because those guys were going to be leaving their capsules and operating the LEM, or the lunar module. So NASA actually built large-scale terrain that looked just like the moon and a rig for helping them to prepare how to successfully lift off from this. And our later missions also, of course, trained on sample collection from the moon's surface. So they would pick up moon rocks with these scoops and tongs and all these other tools while wearing their big, heavy spacesuits too. So all of this is a lot of work, a lot of training that you had to pass back then. But once we reached the space shuttle era, and largely even through today, they significantly eased up some of the requirements for astronauts with the inclusion of roles like the mission specialist and the payload specialist, who could just be scientists and not pilots. And also because of the reduced G-forces that were experienced by the space shuttle versus the capsule. So they had a little bit of a different training there. So before we go on to today in our last few minutes, I want to pause here again and see if we have any last questions. Let's see what we got. Did the Mercury 7 astronauts get to go into space? A few times. So many of them did. You'd think after all of this training, NASA would want to get a lot of use out of them, right? So good bang for your buck there. Wally Schirra was actually the first person to go into space 3 times and was the only astronaut to take part in all 3 of those major missions to get to the moon. So Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. So he definitely had a lot of action up there. John Glenn also, he got to go into space again, even at the age of 77. So they were looking at his body way back then. They were looking at his body now as he was an older gentleman, and really kind of seeing what the effects of space on our bodies when they're a bit older too. Now, Scott Carpenter, though he actually ended up putting his astronaut skills to a different test, he became something called an Aquanaut. So if we remember our naming tradition here, that would mean water sailor, which is kind of redundant and silly. But that basically means, yeah, he lived and he worked under the sea for a while in a sea lab. So that was another exciting experience that you could maybe apply your astronaut skills to as well. So yeah, a lot of them did, and certainly now they definitely send them up quite a bit if they can. All right, any last questions? How can I become an astronaut today? A perfect segue to our next section, everyone. So I'm actually going to walk you through this right now. And this is going to, tell you a little bit more about what training is like today and how maybe you out there, if you are tuning in and interested, can become an astronaut yourself. So let's see here. So today we actually have the ASCAN program, the Astronaut Training program, astronaut candidates. All right. And that is something that they currently use. It began in 1978. And it's typically completed in about 2 years. So it has 16 different basic training courses in life support systems, orbital mechanics, that's moving around, right? Payload deployment, that means, letting things out of your ship, Earth observations, you got medicine, you've got space physiology. I mean, you name it. You can see a number of images actually here from modern day training. Some of it is very similar to the old school stuff. Believe it or not, they still use tilt tables, right? And the survival training out in the middle of nowhere, of course, that sort of thing. And they still fly around in those training planes. But a number of things are also a little more updated for the modern generation, of course. For instance, they now have even more advanced centrifuges. Those can reach up to 20 Gs. And you can see that on the bottom there. That is a very much more advanced centrifuge. So again, they strap you in and whoop, there you go. You're going to really feel that on you. Their Vomit Comet also has an updated plane. And they've also figured out ways that they can simulate partial gravity. So in that top middle picture there, you can see someone hanging while they're using kind of a tool there. So that's really great, for instance, for practicing working on the moon for our upcoming Artemis missions, right? And like their predecessors, the shuttle era pilots also used a number of simulators to experience what it would be like to pilot the space shuttle. And today, we also have a number of simulators for each new vessel that they're using. For instance, we used the Soyuz capsule for a while we were hitching rides with Russia. And now we've got the Orion capsules, that you can see on the right there, which are launched from right here on American soil again. So virtual reality is another thing that has become increasingly popular to help to immerse astronauts into this kind of wild world of space. NASA actually has a whole virtual reality lab now that can simulate visualizations, things like pressure, lighting, the mass, the weight, right? Inertia. So things like spacewalks and the ISS training, International Space System, are becoming more and more realistic in many ways. And then also, of course, talk about your upgrades. We now have a giant neutral buoyancy lab that contains a full-size replica of the International Space Station inside of the world's largest swimming pool. So they even use virtual reality technology inside underwater in the neutral buoyancy pool as well. And here is a fun fact for you. The NFL, the National Football League, consumes 464,000 gallons of Gatorade each season. Well, the neutral buoyancy lab pool here that you can see could hold more than enough Gatorade for 13 seasons of the NFL. So that is over 6 million gallons of water. So it is really, really, really big. So currently, they say that a 6-month mission to the International Space Station takes about 5 years of training to bring us back to that question about how to be an astronaut, right? There has been some speculation, though, that as we reach the next phase of space travel, so we're going to have even longer missions to the moon and then eventually even Mars, they might actually start to use the International Space Station up there itself as an astronaut training facility in space, which means they wouldn't even need to simulate that much because they're actually going to be up there in microgravity. So that could be a cool little shift as well. Now, I mentioned that the requirements to become an astronaut have changed throughout the years. And today, if you at home would like to become a NASA astronaut, these are the basic requirements. All right. So you have to start off by being a US citizen. You have to hold a master's degree in a STEM field, so science, technology, engineering, or math, followed by 2 years of relevant professional experience or 1,000 hours of pilot time in jet aircraft. So now we don't have that restriction, of course, of women anymore not being able to fulfill that role. Now you can have either one. And you also have to pass NASA's astronaut physical, which is not quite as intense as the stuff that we just went over earlier. So you are in for a smoother ride on that one. So all of this is to say, everyone, that, while we have things like space camp and astronaut training experience at the Kennedy Space Center, right? For those of us who maybe aren't as lucky to be selected by NASA as astronaut candidates, the actual work that they're doing and the hours and hours and hours of simulations that they have to experience and go through, they are intense. But we've certainly come a long way since the days of the Mercury program. Now we've got this space program that has some new long-term goals, starting with our Artemis missions, where we are going to be sending the next man and the first woman to the moon, eventually turning it into a jumping off point to then maybe get to Mars. And I'm willing to bet that you are also going to start to see a shift in the types of training that you are going to see as time progresses and as this program evolves, especially also as technology is evolving alongside it. And then also, of course, as we see a lot more private companies stepping in to help out as well. So, my friends, this brings us to the end of our program for today. I know we just went over so much stuff, but hopefully that left you a little bit inspired because, you out there might actually be the next person, the first person, maybe even to step foot on Mars if you want to. So study hard, get all those requirements in, and, maybe someday you can be up there being an astronaut as well. Now, if you have any questions about our program today, any further questions, you can always reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through our social media. And I would like to thank you all so much for watching, sharing your questions and your comments and your answers for those fun questions earlier today. The museum, as you know, hosts a number of live streams just like this one. So please do follow and subscribe to this channel and visit our website for the latest streaming schedule. Also, if you enjoyed this or any of our past programs, we would love your feedback as well. So there is a link that is going to be in the chat for you. I encourage you to click on that link, answer a few questions for us, and that'll help us to plan some future sessions. Now, our next family program is going to be Tuesday at 3 p.m. It is Snacking in Space. So you are going to get to learn a little bit more about what those early astronauts ate while they're in space. And we are talking about all the way from cubes and tubes all the way to modern day where they're eating things like pizza and chocolate chip cookies. And also, what's up with that astronaut ice cream, huh? We'll find out this Tuesday at 3 p.m. right here on our streaming platforms. So once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Our museum is, as a reminder, reopened to the public 7 days a week from 10 to 5 p.m. So if you are in the area, please do come on by and say hello. Otherwise, we hope to see you online for another virtual Intrepid adventure soon. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We'll see you next time.